Support for the Capital Connection comes from
United University Professions, representing 37,000 academic and professional employees at SUNY campuses and teaching hospitals across New York State. Frederick E. Cole, President, uupinfo.org.
It's the Capital Connection. Hi, I'm David Gistina. Joining us this week is Sarah Rogerson. Sarah is a law professor at Albany Law School and the faculty director of the Immigration Law Clinic. She's also involved intimately with the issue of immigration, the migrant issue that we've been hearing about lately in the news. Under her supervision at the Immigration Law Clinic, students represent immigrant victims of crime, including child abuse and neglect, persecution, domestic violence, and sexual assault. Under her supervision, her students also represent wrongfully detained immigrants and regularly participate in legislative advocacy and community outreach initiatives. Before joining the faculty, Professor Rogerson worked as housing and immigrant rights public interest attorney in Newark, New Jersey, and in Dallas, Texas. Her scholarship addresses flaws in the administration of immigration law and policy, including intersections with domestic violence and international law. She has also been published on current issues such as crisis lawyering, education policy, gun safety. Professor Rogerson is also a New York State Municipal Police instructor and is a regular panelist on WAMC Public Radio's The Round Table. Many of our listeners are familiar with her. Those of you around the state, you can read more about Professor Rogerson at albanylaw.edu. Welcome, Sarah Rogerson.
I'm so glad to be here.
Glad that you agreed to come because it's been quite a busy week in upstate New York. Recently, we saw the New York City mayor, Eric Adams, sending migrants, so-called migrants, upstate. Some communities said, nah, not so fast. We're going to have a state of emergency. We don't want them in our hotels. Some even said things like, well, we don't know who these people are. We don't know what kind of crimes they might have committed. You had other places like Westchester County where George Latimer, the county executive there, welcomed migrants. But overall, the issue is they're here. What do we do? How do we get them the services that they need? And how welcoming are we going to be? Can you give us a sort of update? I know you're in the thick of it, of what's happened this week specifically in Albany County.
I am in the thick of a joyful, beautiful, celebratory welcome, and I would not want to be anywhere else. New York State has been welcoming immigrants and refugees from all over the world for centuries. There are 4.4 million immigrants in New York State, making up a quarter of the entire population. This is not new, and Albany is, of course, the capital of that state, one of the most powerful states in the country. So this is an opportunity, really, to signal to the rest of the country that we need to undo the harmful rhetoric that was hypercharged under the Trump administration. We need to shut down any of that rhetoric that's happening in our county or in our localities, particularly in New York State. And what's more than a little distressing is that the way that this has happened, unfortunately, it didn't have to happen this way. But, one day maybe we'll write a good government paper about how to do this better the next time. But these folks are arriving in Albany with less information about them than, some of our ancestors arrived at Ellis Island fleeing World War II. And that's a real problem on the ground. So we have like a short-term logistical issue because we have to do things the hard way, identify where people are coming from, what languages they speak, and so on.
Can I ask, because I know some of the county executives, even Newhouse of Orange County, Steve Newhouse, who seemed a little more reasonable than some, but was saying some of the information we just don't have. They have lanyards, but we don't know what status they are, who they are. So there is an information gap.
There's an information gap. And what I'm seeing from a good government perspective is Albany County is really working hard with these other counties to say, like, all right, what are you guys seeing? How can we build on what you've been doing? The frustrating thing is that all of this could have been avoided with like a logistical, orderly process. And, I think after the dust settles and we see some of the key breakdowns in communication, that would be a really interesting area of focus for improvement. But in the meantime, really sort of this is a moment for New York State to decide whether they want to be on the right side of history or whether we're going to continue the steep decline in our immigration laws and policies, and send a message, quite honestly, to Washington, D.C. that, you don't need to fix this system. It's fine the way that it is. It's working exactly as it was designed to, which is, racist and exclusionary. We can send a different message to D.C., and I hope that we do.
And we don't know who these people are necessarily, and that's not a judgment. Who are these people that you work with? What are the services that you're trying to provide them? With information, we can alleviate what seems to be a prevalent emotion in our society, fear.
So one thing that we do know about all of these folks is that they are seeking asylum. At some point in the process of, and many of them came from the border, right? And were sent to New York City without process either. So there's plenty of blame to go around. I'm not assigning blame yet until we know more about what happened. But one thing is clear is that there were individuals in border areas, some who were political actors, who were politically motivated to send people, whether or not it was willful or not, to New York. And now we're working on doing the job that the federal government should be doing. Fine. So be that as it may, the one piece of information that we do have is that everybody is seeking asylum. So everyone has fled religious, political, gender-based persecution. There's a whole parade of horribles that I could list and talk in detail about, but that would be a really depressing show. We know that these folks are seeking protection. Asylum is a lawful way to enter the United States. If you enter the United States without permission and claim asylum, you are still lawfully seeking a path to citizenship. So for people who are saying, why don't these people get in line? They're in line. They're in line. The problem is that our federal immigration system is so broken that asylum seekers don't automatically get work authorization, right? And that's the big ask from county and state leaders to the federal government right now. Shorten the time for employment authorization and make sure asylum seekers are eligible for it now or in 30 days, subject to a vetting process and fingerprints and all that stuff, right? Way more security than you ask for when you get new neighbors, right? When people move in next to you in your house or apartment or dwelling space, wherever you are, you don't ask to see their papers and their criminal history. You don't tell them to submit to fingerprinting. You just say hey, here's some cookies. Hopefully we have something in common and don't argue with each other, right? And maybe something even more beautiful than that. So that's what we're attempting to do in a mass movement situation in hotel rooms, which is not ideal.
There's so many different directions we can go in with this. We're speaking with Sarah Rogerson. She is a professor at Albany Law School and faculty director of the Immigration Law Clinic. You said that I could tell these stories all day long. It would make the show really depressing, but it makes a point, doesn't it? Can you put a face on it for us, a family face on for us? Tell us a story. People sometimes need to know about other people before it really settles.
Sure. I've been doing this work, and as you mentioned in my bio, I started doing immigration work really in law school in New Jersey, but then I was employed by a nonprofit shortly thereafter in Dallas, Texas, under the Bush administration. So I've been doing this work for almost 20 years. So what I can do is give you a mashup of different stories that I've heard. These are the things that keep me up at night sometimes. And these are the things that are causing lots of immigration lawyers and service providers to leave the profession, to be quite honest, because for 20 years, things have gotten worse, not better, especially after 9/11, which was more than 20 years ago, but happened while I was in law school and informed my whole experience around this. So say, for example, husband and wife from a country in sub-Saharan Africa on the continent. The wife works for the United Nations, and there is a coup in their country, and the United Nations workers are seen as having been in cahoots with the former leadership. And so UN workers are also under attack, right? Somehow they're able to escape the country. She's 7 months pregnant and has been previously detained in her country for stretches of time. And they find a route to escape. They get on a boat or a plane to somewhere in Central America because it's easier than getting to the United States. Then they make a long trip up Central America through Mexico and South America and swim across the Rio Grande when it's full. It's sometimes in the summertime. It's not so grand, but in some places. But they make it across the border zone. They find their way to a little office in Dallas, Texas, and I'm sitting in front of them, and I have 45 minutes to do an intake and assess whether or not we can take their case. And within 48 hours, the wife gives birth to a United States citizen because birthright citizenship is still a thing. And that whole family deserves to be safe, right? And that's one of a million horrible, awful stories that are presented. And you have to remember that the grant rates for asylum in this country are not awesome. So, and it really depends judge by judge. There was one judge that I appeared before in Dallas who had something like a 10 or 11% grant rate on asylum cases. It was just miserable to have to try these cases in front of him.
But the woman who had the baby, and the baby has the right of citizenship, but the parents don't have the right of citizenship.
No, they had to file for asylum.
I got to know what happened.
Yeah, they had to file for asylum. They had to prove that their marriage was real. Because remember, because the wife was persecuted doesn't mean automatically that the husband can get protection. So every single case that I worked on, the initial filings, never mind like supplementary motions or like psychological evaluations, we'd bring them in like big banker's boxes because they were like maybe a foot deep in paperwork, times 3 because you have to send 1 to the State Department, 2 have to go, blah, 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 blah. There's like all these there's no way to navigate the system without a lawyer, and there's no guaranteed right to counsel.
Is it in their language if they don't speak English?
Oh, no. Heavens, no. All of the immigration documents are in English. And so you have to have a qualified interpreter translator, ideally not a family member to avoid conflicts or misinterpretation. It's not easy. It's really hard.
So you haven't told me, did the family get to stay together eventually?
They did.
They did. But at the time, is there a separation? Is the child still with both parents? I mean, how did that work?
No, that worked out because that was under the Obama administration, actually. Family separation, I could talk about for 10 million years. We had a woman, you might remember in the summer of 2018, when Albany, at the height of the Trump family separation crisis. Like, we separate families all the time by virtue of legal systems and processes that don't work well together. It happens constantly, so I don't want to minimize that. But the big, like, ProPublica exposed intentional federal policy of ripping children out of parents' arms and them never seeing each other again in the summer of 2018. Albany County intervened in that situation too, brought people up to relieve the burden down at the border because there was like a claim that, like, in part because they were like detaining everybody and then asking questions later as opposed to asking questions up front. So there was like a real humanitarian crisis at the border that was manufactured by the Trump administration to make people fear others. So we asked for no separated families. We asked just to relieve the burden. We asked for legal, we made sure that legal services would be directed to this group so that they could get out of a detained setting very quickly. We also expected an orderly process there of like 40 people every 2 weeks. They sent over 300 people in 8 days. So we have experience doing this rapid response and sort of rapid needs assessment in a detained setting. So we did all of that. We got 98% of those folks passed what's called a credible fear interview, which is the initial interview before you are allowed to continue with your asylum claim, right? So incredibly successful. Lots of people get out of a detained setting. But the one of the women that I interviewed, because I had to fill in for one of our shifts because somebody had something come up, was a woman whose kids were U.S. citizens. They were ripped from her arms at the border. She was holding on to their Social Security cards and their vaccination records and had been for about 3 weeks. They were sweaty, from her holding on to them through this whole journey from the border to Albany to getting checked into the jail and then to living in the jail for a couple of weeks. And she gave them to me so that I could get them to her sister so that her sister, who was in California, could care for the children there. I mean, like, this is untenable.
All in the name of finding a, quote, better place.
Yeah, she was an asylum seeker. I haven't followed her case closely, but she's had a lawful asylum claim for protection for asylum.
Now, let's bring it back to this week. Can you tell us a story of someone you've interacted with this week? First of all, how many have showed up in Albany as a result of the folks coming from New York City?
So at this point, we are at close to 200. There were another 68 individuals who were brought up to Albany. I have been dispatching lawyers to interview folks one-on-one. And right now we're doing a basic needs assessment and like emergency legal issues assessment. But I can say that, like, for example, New York City sent us somebody who has a check-in today in New York City with ICE. Theoretically, if a lawyer didn't intervene, well, not theoretically, if a lawyer hadn't have intervened pretty quickly, that person could be deported for not reporting to their ICE check-in.
Could they do that by Zoom or some technological way, or do they have to be rushed down to New York?
ICE check-ins typically, unless you have an arrangement with ICE, and even if you have an arrangement with ICE to do like a phone check-in, they still require in-person occasionally. So in this case, it was an in-person check-in. So that person was facing the idea of having to be driven all the way back down to New York City for a check-in because whatever is happening on the ground in New York City, they are not screening people for basic pieces of information.
You've talked about this before when we had Governor Abbott in Texas sending migrants, and then we had Florida, right? They were coming up from Florida from DeSantis. They ended up in Martha's Vineyard?
Martha's
Vineyard, right. And they had check-ins back in Texas.
You know what's really beautiful about that story is that was like really underreported because it happened way after the fact, but it's one of my favorite things, is when it was discovered that those people were transported involuntarily or with like mixed messages about where they were going, what would be offered to them there, it became very apparent that there was a potential human trafficking claim there against Ron DeSantis because of the lack of voluntariness in transport. So what happened was the sheriff in the Texas county that they departed from, where they were quote unquote, like recruited to get on the bus or plane or whatever took them to Martha's Vineyard. He did an investigation and determined that everybody had been lied to about this trip. And so he signed off on what's called a Supplement B law enforcement certification for a U visa, which is a visa for victims of certain crimes. Really another parade of horribles, but all the awful crimes you can think of. If you're a victim of any of these statutorily listed crimes, you can get a visa and eventually work your way through the system to get citizenship. He signed off on the Supplement B and then worked with an attorney who was on the ground in Martha's Vineyard to file U visa applications on behalf of all these people. So the individuals that Ron DeSantis was playing political football with were actually put on a pathway to status because of his allegedly criminal behavior.
The issues that you study, Sarah Rogerson, professor at Albany Law and faculty director of the Immigration Law Clinic, are thus family law, human rights, immigration law, and international law, all intricately intertwined every day as you do your work. Mm-hmm. And that's quite something when we're talking about, as you just said, the legal issues you have to work through with your clients. Can you talk about some of those legal issues, especially when you're doing this emergency assessment? You got to narrow it down quick. What are the legal issues? You mentioned work before,
yep.
But what are some of those legal issues?
So work authorization, you have some people who are in the process of being actively deported from the United States through a process that we make sound a little bit nicer called removal proceedings. That's an immigration court hearing, right? It's really important. I want to reiterate that these are civil proceedings. This is a civil code. It's a civil federal code, right? So there's criminal law that's woven throughout all of this, but it's sort of like a subsection of what we deal with. It's like crimes happen, and then there's like an immigration component to it, either from a victim standpoint or even a perpetrator standpoint. But like that is like a whole class that I could teach a semester on. So I'm going to say, for the purposes of this conversation and anything in immigration court, it's civil. That means there's no guaranteed right to a lawyer. Like, you can have a lawyer if you can find one and afford one, but there's no like civil Gideon. So Gideon versus Wainwright, which was the Supreme Court case that provided for state-funded counsel to criminal defendants, right? There's no equivalent of that in immigration law. People are shocked to find that out. Kids as young as 5 years old have appeared in immigration court alone against a government attorney.
I mean, let me just say, how can that be?
It's true.
Especially when you have people who may be fleeing for their lives.
Well, let me tell you why. Part of the reason is because these judges are actually within the Department of Justice. They are not an independent judiciary. The Executive Office for Immigration Review is within the Department of Justice, which is the executive function of the federal government, right? So the Attorney General has unlimited discretion in immigration cases by statute. This is like not by accident. This is by design. So we designed our immigration systems to fast track deportations. And then under Trump, it got worse and worse and worse. I also was reading really interesting statistics that we invest 8 times more funding in border control, and I'm going to put control in quotation marks because a lot of money gets wasted trying to figure out what's going on at the border because it's done in sort of like a militarized way as opposed to thinking about how people move and how that's like a natural function of people and animals and the planet and how we function. It's designed for war. So we invest 8 times more in that than we do in the court system and USCIS that processes the visas, all of the things that are supposed to help people get in line and then get on the path to citizenship. We spend 8 times more money on dealing with the border. Yeah.
So that would lead me to, wouldn't that include, if the money was put into these other areas, the technology? I mean, why can't there be a universal system you log into that would have the information of who's coming up on the buses, that the local officials could see, that everyone could share, and it would be so much more efficient, wouldn't it be?
Well, I do want to flag that the information issues, like, can you imagine if all of that information was available to, for example, the town of Colony, who made it very clear, the leadership there, that these folks were not welcome, right? We wouldn't want that sensitive information in the hands of people who could do harm with it, potentially by releasing that information without consideration for how these individuals might be targeted by that information. So I'm not making any specific allegations. I'm just saying, like, in these unfriendly, hostile pockets of New York State, that information is not safe in the hands of government actors. And so as lawyers, we intervene to keep the information safe, help people through the process, but engage government actors in ways that can help and support these folks where we have friendly government officials.
How does New York compare to other states?
It depends on what metric, right? Like New York is leading the way on a lot of things, including funding civil legal services for immigration. New York is the first in the country, I believe, to have a statewide representation program for people who are facing removal proceedings. It's called NIFUP, but it's a family unity project, right? Trying to keep families together and keep parents from being deported. And, you know, in some cases, I just want to flag that as a family law issue. Sometimes the person that's deported is the primary caretaker and the victim of domestic violence, and the kids are left with an abuser who just happens to be a U.S. citizen. Like, this is how bonkers this is. So New York is leading the way. There are several pieces of important legislation that are for consideration in the state legislature now, including a bill that would expand the right to counsel and funding of counsel for immigrants in New York State so that you wouldn't have to be like actively facing a threat of deportation in order to access a government-funded lawyer. So New York's leading the way in that regard. I think budgets are moral documents, so like the proof is in the budget. Funding was increased this round of budget for some immigrant legal services, but like we have a long way to go to really live up to our reputation on this issue.
And the problem will only get larger, right? I know you have a new project you're working on. It has to do with the climate impact and the idea that we know, the climate scientists suggest it, and we're already seeing it. People are leaving their areas because they're no longer livable and will be making their way to the safer parts of the world. And I'm sure some of that will be right here in America.
Yeah, Albany is part of a swath of this country that is known as a climate haven, meaning we will suffer less the consequences of a lack of attention to climate change. So as that happens, as sea levels rise, as weather patterns become more unpredictable, we are in a space that's pretty sheltered from that. Like, things will change, seasons will be different. I leave that up to the scientists who know how all that works. But one thing is clear, we will see an influx of people to this region. And I say people, but like I could say migrants, even if they're U.S. citizens coming from other states. I could say that. It wasn't so long ago in our country's history that we had like sheriffs patrolling state borders to keep poor people out of different states. Like, that could happen again. And it sounds alarmist now, but the things that I'm saying like earlier in this program have sounded alarmist 30 years ago. It's coming. And the sooner that we can figure out how to be more welcoming, more inclusive, offer more wraparound government services and resettlement, or even just give space to let people succeed on their own, right? Like, the American dream can be really interrupted when you have to try to do that from a jail. How are you supposed to do that? So if we can figure out our way through this immigration moment, it could help a large population of American citizens who will be looking for safe haven in the not too distant future.
What it seems like is that in many cases, our immigration system ends up re-victimizing people.
Over and over and over and over and over again. Because if you lose your case at one level, you have to retell your story at an appellate level. And if your story differs, that's a basis on which to deny you relief. So a story I was talking about yesterday was a client that I had who was sexually assaulted. She was fleeing persistent domestic violence in her home country. There was like a law enforcement aspect to it. Like, it's always harder when the abuser is a law enforcement officer, right? Because they know more people. This person was widely known in her country. She ended up getting denied. Her case was denied because she messed up the date of her gynecological exam that documented her sexual assault. The date that she said on the witness stand was different than the date that was in the doctor's report. That was a primary basis for denying her asylum.
I'll let that sit out there for people to think about. She is Sarah Rogerson. She's been our guest on the Capital Connection this week. I'm David Gistina. Sarah Rogerson is an Albany law professor and faculty director of the Immigration Law Clinic. I can't thank you enough, Sarah, for spending the time with us to talk about this very, very important issue in New York, around the country, and around the world.
My pleasure.
The Capital Connection is a production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. You can listen to The Capital Connection anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or anywhere you get your podcasts. You can sign up for weekly show updates by subscribing to our newsletter, Airwaves, and by following us on social media at WAMC Radio. Thanks for listening.